The trail they chose was not a secret. It didn't wind through forbidden land or cut across dangerous terrain marked by warning signs and red tape. It was, by all measurable standards, ordinary. Locals spoke of it with a kind of familiarity reserved for places that blend into daily life, a backdrop rather than a destination. Parents brought their children there on weekends. Dog walkers traced its first stretch every morning. Runners used it for training, memorizing its curves and inclines until the path felt predictable, almost dull. That familiarity was part of its appeal. The trail had a reputation for being forgiving, clearly marked entrances, posted maps, wooden signposts placed at regular intervals, each one offering reassurance that someone had been here before and would be here again. It wasn't the kind of place people got lost, at least not in any permanent way. If you wandered off the path, you noticed quickly. If you turned around, the trail was always there to guide you back. It existed within a larger forest, but even that forest had been softened by time and use. This was an untouched wilderness. It had been logged decades earlier, replanted, managed, shaped by human decisions. Wide areas allowed sunlight to reach the ground. Undergrowth was present, but not aggressive. You could see where you were going. You could see where you had been. When people talk about the trail, they often mention how peaceful it felt. Not silent, but calm. The kind of calm that encourages conversation, reflection, the easy sharing of thoughts that only come when movement becomes automatic. It was the sort of place where friendships deepened and arguments softened, where people felt temporarily removed from urgency without ever feeling truly isolated. For them, the choice felt natural. They had talked about hiking before, always in passing, always with the casual tone of people who assumed there would always be time later. That morning later had arrived. There was no grand reason for it, no anniversary, no celebration, just a shared day off and the quiet desire to do something simple together. They were different in temperament, but compatible in rhythm. One tended to speak first, filling silence easily, narrating thoughts as they came. The other listened more than they talked, responding thoughtfully, sometimes with humor, sometimes with long pauses that never felt uncomfortable. On the trail, those differences worked in harmony. Conversation didn't have to be constant. Silence didn't need explanation. They prepared the way people prepare for something routine. Comfortable clothes, sturdy shoes, water bottles filled but not obsessively measured, no emergency beacon, no satellite phone, just phones in their pockets, trusting that they would be enough if needed. They weren't inexperienced. They understood the basics. They just didn't believe they were stepping into a situation that would require anything more than common sense. The map at the trailhead was clear. Several loops branched off from the main path, each marked with distance and estimated time. They likely discussed which route to take briefly, pointing, nodding, agreeing without debate. Whichever one they chose, it was meant to lead them back to the same place they started. People later tried to reconstruct that choice, as if the exact turn they took could explain everything that followed. But the truth is, every option available to them led somewhere known, somewhere documented, somewhere walked thousands of times before. As they moved deeper into forest, the world adjusted around them in small, gradual ways. The sounds of the road faded. The air cooled slightly. The light filtered differently, broken into fragments by branches overhead. These were the changes people seek when they step into nature, not to escape, but to soften the edges of their lives. They were seen by others that morning. A jogger passed them early on, offering a polite nod. A couple walking in the opposite direction remembered them later only because they seemed relaxed, unhurried. Nothing about their presence lingered in memory. They did not argue. They did not rush. They did not stop anyone to ask for directions. In hindsight, that ordinariness became disturbing, because when something goes wrong, we expect there to be a moment where behavior shifts, where tension appears, where someone does something that later feels like a mistake. In this case, there was no such moment. The trail did not challenge them. The forest did not resist them. Everything unfolded exactly as it should have. Cell phone data would later show brief, unremarkable activity early in the hike. A photo, a quick message, then nothing. Not a sudden cutoff. Not a desperate attempt to connect. Just silence, beginning so quietly it went unnoticed. Search teams would later walk those same paths and remark on how clear everything still felt, how easy it was to imagine two people moving through the space without difficulty, how little the terrain offered in terms of explanation. No steep drops, no hidden ravines, no fast-moving water nearby. If someone had fallen, they would have been found. That fact would become one of the most unsettling elements of the case. The trail did not behave like a place where people disappear. It behaved like a place where people return home tired but satisfied, carrying stories that fade quickly with time. Those who knew them best struggled with that contradiction. They replayed conversations, recalled small details. One of them had mentioned sore muscles from the week before. The other had laughed it off. Neither had expressed concern about the hike. Neither had seemed distracted or troubled. There was no indication that either of them intended not to come back. Speculation eventually filled the space left by facts. Some suggested they may have decided, impulsively, to leave the trail and explore deeper into the forest. But those who knew them found that hard to believe. They were curious, yes, but cautious, not reckless, not prone to spontaneous risks without reason. Others suggested an accident, an injury that left them unable to move. But again, the environment argued against it. And even if one of them had been hurt, the other would not have left. They would have stayed. They would have called for help. They would have been heard. The trail itself offered no evidence of deviation, no broken branches indicating a struggle, no disturbed soil suggesting a fall, no dropped items marking a point of crisis. It was as if they walked forward and then simply stopped being part of the landscape. As days passed and search efforts intensified, the trail transformed from a place of leisure into a grid of possibilities. Every turn was measured, every loop traced. The same paths that once felt comforting now felt accusatory, as if daring investigators to find what was missing. But the forest gave nothing back. In the years that followed, the trail remained open. People continued to walk it, often unaware of the story tied to its trees. Those who did know felt a subtle tension underfoot, a quiet awareness that something unresolved lingered there. The path did not change. The signage remained. The maps were updated, reprinted, replaced. The idea that two people could vanish from such a place unsettled everyone who tried to understand it. Because if it could happen there, on a trail everyone knew, in a forest shaped and softened by human hands, then it challenged the belief that familiarity equals safety. That belief had guided them that morning. It had shaped their confidence, their preparation, their ease. They trusted the trail, because so many others had trusted it before, and the trail accepted them without question. It was only later, when they didn't come back, that people began to wonder whether the forest had always been something else entirely. Not dangerous, not malicious, but capable of holding on to what entered it quietly, without explanation. The path remained visible. The logic remained sound. The people did not. At first, nothing felt wrong. Absence does not announce itself. It begins as a delay, a minor disruption that seems easily explained, a late return, a phone battery drained, a trail that took longer than expected. The kind of things people brush aside because worry feels premature, almost embarrassing, when there are still reasonable explanations available. The expected time came and went quietly. No call, no message. The mountain, meanwhile, continued doing what it always did. Light shifted through the trees. Shadows lengthened. The trail emptied as other hikers made their way back to their cars, boots dusty, stories intact. Somewhere, a gate closed for the evening. Somewhere else, a ranger logged the day as uneventful. At home, the waiting began with patience. Dinner sat cooling longer than planned. A television played without being watched. Every few minutes, there was a glance toward a phone, not in panic, but in casual expectation. The assumption of return still held. It always had before. As the sky darkened, patience thinned. Calls went unanswered. Voicemail picked up with the same familiar tone, now suddenly inadequate. The first edge of unease crept in, subtle but persistent. Not fear yet, just a feeling that the world had slipped slightly out of alignment. Night fell faster than anyone was ready for. In the mountains, darkness is not gradual. It arrives fully formed, swallowing trails and landmarks, changing distances and familiar shapes into something unrecognizable. Temperatures dropped. Wind moved through the trees in long, hollow breaths. This was the moment when concern became action. A friend drove to the trailhead, headlights cutting through the dark. The parking area was mostly empty now, but one car remained, unlocked, undisturbed, exactly where it had been left that morning. The sight of it shifted everything. Possibility collapsed inward. The range of reasonable explanations narrowed abruptly. People stood in the quiet lot, listening to the night, suddenly aware of how little it offered in response. Phone calls multiplied. Local authorities were notified. Names were spelled carefully over the line. Clothing descriptions repeated. The word hiker took on a weight it hadn't carried before. Somewhere, a form was opened. A clock started running, though no one could say what it was counting down to. Search procedures moved slowly at first, bound by protocol and daylight. Flashlights traced the beginning of the trail, their beams thin and uncertain against the vastness beyond. Voices called out a name that echoed back unchanged, as if the mountain refused to personalize the sound. Every unanswered call sharpened the silence. It wasn't just the absence of a person anymore. It was the absence of reassurance, of confirmation, of anything that could push the story in one direction or another. By morning, the disappearance was no longer theoretical. It had weight. The sun rose over a situation that had no clear shape yet, only edges of worry and fear. People gathered at the trailhead, faces drawn, movements tense. The mountain looked the same as it had the day before. Indifferent, beautiful, vast. Search and rescue teams assembled with efficiency born of experience. Maps were spread across hoods of vehicles. Sections were assigned. Radio channels tested. Dogs paced, alert and focused, unaware of the emotional gravity surrounding them. To them, this was a task. To everyone else, it was a fracture opening wider by the hour. The trail, once a place of solitude, filled with purpose-driven movement. Boots pressed new patterns into the dirt. Voices carried farther now, calling a name with urgency. Every bend in the path carried a surge of hope, immediately followed by disappointment. What makes moments like this unbearable is not just fear, but imagination. With no information, the mind fills the gaps mercilessly. A twisted ankle, a missed turn, a fall just out of sight. Each possibility plays out in vivid detail, then gives way to the next. The mountain does not correct these thoughts. It offers no reassurance. Its scale amplifies helplessness, reminding everyone involved how small a single person can be against miles of terrain. As hours passed, optimism drained quietly. Not all at once, but in increments. Each cleared section of trail that yielded nothing felt like a door closing. Each radio update that reported negative findings tightened the knot in everyone's chest. The silence was no longer neutral. It felt deliberate, as if the trail itself had decided not to speak. Family members hovered at the edges of the operation, close enough to hear updates, far enough to stay out of the way. Their role was waiting, watching people disappear into the trees and return empty-handed, learning the strange vocabulary of search efforts, terms that sounded technical but translated roughly to "we don't know yet." There is a particular cruelty in this phase of disappearance. It exists in a space before tragedy is confirmed, but after safety can be assumed. Hope is still alive, but it is fragile, easily shaken by every passing hour. Time stretches unnaturally, minutes feeling like hours, hours dissolving without meaning. Night came again, bringing forced pauses and renewed fear. Searches scaled back. Darkness reclaimed the mountain. People went home reluctantly, carrying guilt for leaving and exhaustion for staying. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and haunted by imagined sounds and half-formed conclusions. The trail stopped answering back, not because it had something to hide, but because it never had answers to begin with. It simply existed, holding whatever truth lay within it, indifferent to the human urgency pressing against its edges. By the time the second morning arrived, the absence had fully transformed into a mystery. Not yet cold, not yet defined, but no longer something that could be explained away by patience or optimism. Someone had gone into the mountain to clear their mind. The mountain had taken the opportunity to clear all certainty in return. By the fourth day, the search no longer felt like a reaction. It had become a system. What began as concern had hardened into procedure, shaped by experience and protocols designed for moments exactly like this. The forest was no longer approached with hesitation, but with measured intent. Maps were unfolded, grids were drawn, and every decision was justified by logic rather than hope. Teams were assigned sections based on terrain, visibility, and probability. The trail itself was no longer the focus that had been walked, rewalked, and scrutinized until it offered nothing more. Attention shifted outward into the spaces people rarely choose unless something has gone wrong. Thick stands of trees, slopes that required careful footing, areas where the ground dipped just enough to obscure sightlines. Each searcher carried the same quiet expectation that somewhere, just beyond the next rise or behind the next cluster of brush, something would finally appear. Not necessarily them, alive and waiting, but something that would explain why they weren't. A piece of clothing, a backpack, a sign that would break the silence the forest had imposed. Search and rescue dogs were deployed again, this time with greater precision. Handlers moved slowly, allowing the animals to work without interference. The dogs traced paths that made sense, then abruptly lost interest, as if the story they were following had ended mid-sentence. Handlers documented these moments carefully. Sudden scent loss was rare, and when it occurred, it usually pointed toward specific explanations. None of them fit here. Helicopters circled above the canopy, their presence more symbolic than practical. From the air, the forest appeared endless but orderly, a patchwork of green broken only by narrow lines where trails cut through. Nothing stood out, no flashes of color, no movement where there shouldn't be any, just trees, repeating themselves in quiet defiance of human attention. Investigators studied timelines next. The hikers had entered the trail mid-morning. Under normal conditions, even with extended stops, they should have exited by late afternoon. If something had happened early, they would have had time to call for help. If something had happened later, they would still have been reachable before nightfall. The absence of any contact became more troubling with each recalculation. Searchers were trained to think in patterns. People who get lost behave predictably. They follow downhill paths. They move toward water. They respond to sound. They leave behind indicators, even if unintentionally. This case refused to align with any of those behaviors. Every area that fit the profile was searched thoroughly. Creek bed were checked. Clearings were examined. Natural shelters, fallen trees, rock formations were inspected. Nothing suggested that anyone had passed through in distress. As the days stretched on, fatigue set in, but it did not dull focus. If anything, it sharpened it. The longer the forest resisted explanation, the more determined the searchers became. There was a sense, unspoken but shared, that something about this disappearance was different, not more dangerous, not more dramatic, just wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. Volunteers came and went, but core teams remained. They moved methodically, recording everything. Even the absence of evidence was logged, because absence itself had become the defining feature of the case. Weather conditions were reviewed repeatedly. There had been no sudden storms, no extreme temperatures, no environmental events that could have altered the terrain or erased traces. The forest, in that regard, had been cooperative. It had not changed. It had not hidden evidence behind fresh snowfall or heavy rain. What wasn't there had never been there. Investigators considered the possibility of foul play, not because there was evidence of it, but because the lack of evidence forced them to widen the frame. Could someone have encountered them on the trail? Could something have happened quickly, decisively, without leaving signs? The trail's popularity worked against that theory. Too many people passed through, too many potential witnesses, too many chances for something to be noticed. Yet nothing had been. The idea that two people could be removed from such a place without a trace unsettled even the most experienced responders. This was not remote wilderness. This was not a place where mistakes vanished quietly. And yet, here they were, searching a forest that felt increasingly indifferent to their efforts. As the grid expanded, so did the questions. Why were there no dropped items? No torn clothing? No footprints leading away from the trail? Even in cases where individuals deliberately leave a path, something remains behind. Humans are not clean in their movement. We disturb what we pass through, but the forest showed no disturbance. Each evening, teams regrouped. Briefings were held. Maps were updated with colored markings that represented hours of effort and miles of ground covered. The unmarked areas grew smaller, but the uncertainty grew larger. The space left by the missing hikers felt disproportionate to the area being searched, as if it existed somewhere else entirely. Families listened to updates with quiet intensity. They learned new terminology, probability zones, last known points. They watched professionals explain why certain areas were prioritized and others deprioritized. They tried to read meaning into tone, into pauses, into the careful way optimism was expressed without commitment. One of the most unsettling conclusions emerged gradually. If the hikers were still within the search area, they should have been found by now. That realization did not end the search, but it changed it. The focus shifted from rescue to recovery, though no one said those words out loud. The forest had crossed an invisible threshold, and the search followed reluctantly behind. Experts from outside agencies were consulted. Fresh eyes were invited in, not because previous efforts were flawed, but because perspective can matter when logic stalls. Each expert reviewed the same data and reached the same quiet impasse. There was no place where everything pointed. The trailhead, once a neutral starting point, became a symbol of failure. Searchers stood there and tried to imagine what must have looked like hours after the hikers entered, empty, silent, waiting. It offered no insight now, only the reminder that every disappearance begins with a place where someone should have returned. As the second week approached, the forest seemed unchanged by the attention it had received. Paths were still clear. Trees still stood. The environment showed no signs of having been disturbed by a crisis. It was as if the search itself existed in a different reality, one layered over the forest without leaving a mark. That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all, the sense that something significant had happened without interacting with the physical world in any detectable way. Search leaders began to prepare for the inevitable. Resources could not be committed indefinitely. Other cases existed. Other calls would come. The decision to scale back would be framed carefully, but it would come, and when it did, it would leave behind a forest that had been measured, mapped, and examined, yet still held nothing. The hikers had not been found because there was nothing to find, or because whatever had happened had left no permission for discovery. The forest remained silent, not as an adversary, but as a witness that refused to speak. When the search slowed, something else took its place. The absence of movement in the forest created a vacuum, and into that vacuum came speculation. It arrived quietly at first, in hushed conversations and cautious suggestions, then grew louder as days turned into weeks and weeks into months. People needed explanations. If the forest would not provide them, the mind would try to manufacture its own. The first theories were practical, almost comforting in their familiarity. An accident, perhaps, a slip, a fall, an injury that left one of them unable to move. In this version of events, the others stayed behind, unwilling to leave. The problem with that theory wasn't imagination, it was geography. The terrain had been studied extensively. There were no cliffs hidden behind brush, no ravines deep enough to swallow two people without a trace. If someone had fallen, there would have been signs, disturbed ground, broken vegetation, something to follow. None of that existed. Another possibility suggested they had wandered off the trail intentionally. People sometimes do, driven by curiosity or the illusion of shortcuts. But those who knew them struggled to accept this. They weren't reckless. They didn't chase uncertainty for the thrill of it. And even if they had stepped off the path briefly, logic dictated that they would have returned. The forest was not disorienting in that way. You could hear the trail long before you saw it. You could feel the openness return. The idea that they became lost persisted anyway, because it always does. Getting lost is a universal fear, one that feels plausible in any wooded space. But lost people leave patterns. They double back. They circle. They leave signs of frustration and fatigue. The search teams found none of these. The absence of confusion was as notable as the absence of presence. Then there was a suggestion of wildlife. This theory surfaced quietly, often accompanied by lowered voices and quick dismissals. Large animals existed in the region, but encounters were rare, attacks rarer still. And even in those tragic cases, evidence remained. Noise, disturbance, remains. The forest would have remembered something like that. It hadn't. As rational explanations weakened, darker ones emerged. Could they have met someone on the trail? Someone with harmful intent? The idea was unsettling precisely because it introduced another human variable into what had felt like a natural mystery. But again, the trail resisted the theory. Too many people passed through that day. Too many opportunities for someone to notice something wrong. Violence, even controlled, leaves marks. The forest showed none. Some suggested voluntary disappearance. That the hike was a cover, a final moment before leaving everything behind. It was an idea born not of evidence, but of desperation. Families rejected it immediately. There had been no preparation, no financial irregularities, no strained relationships, no reason to believe either of them wanted to vanish from their own lives. Yet the theory persisted because it offered something the others did not: agency. It suggested choice rather than an unexplainable erasure. Online forums eventually discovered the case. Strangers dissected timelines and photographs with a detached intensity that felt invasive to those closest to the story. Every smile was analyzed. Every detail was given weight. It was never meant to carry. Theories multiplied, branching into increasingly improbable directions. Some focused on the sudden loss of scent reported by the dogs. Others fixated on the exact point where tracking became impossible. Maps were redrawn, routes reimagined. Each new explanation claimed to solve the mystery, yet none could account for all the known facts without creating new questions. What made the speculation so relentless was the sense that the case was incomplete. It lacked the finality people rely on to move forward. There was no body to mourn, no official cause to accept, just a question suspended in time. Investigators, bound by evidence rather than imagination, remained cautious. They documented theories, but committed to none. Privately, many admitted that nothing fit. The case existed in a space between categories, refusing to settle into any established pattern. This refusal was deeply unsettling. Human beings are conditioned to believe that every event has an explanation, even if it takes time to uncover. This case challenged that belief. It suggested the possibility that something could happen without leaving behind the narrative structure we expect. Families lived inside that uncertainty every day. They were asked questions they could not answer. Did they argue? Did they seem distracted? Was there anything unusual about their behavior? Over time, those questions began to feel accusatory, as if the failure to explain the disappearance reflected some personal oversight. Grief took on an unusual shape. Without confirmation of death, there was no closure. Without evidence of survival, there was no hope. They existed in a suspended state, unable to move fully toward mourning or belief. As months turned into years, the theories did not fade. They hardened. Each person seemed to choose the explanation they could live with, regardless of its plausibility. Some needed to believe it was an accident. Others clung to the idea of foul play. A few entertained more abstract possibilities, not because they believed them, but because the alternatives felt even more unbearable. The forest, meanwhile, remained unchanged. Seasons passed. Leaves fell and returned. Snow covered the trail, then melted. New hikers walked the same paths, unaware of the speculation tied to the ground beneath their feet. The place where two people had vanished became just another place again, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, the mystery deepened. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more it resisted explanation. Time did not clarify it. It complicated it. Every theory shared the same fatal flaw. It required evidence that did not exist. And the lack of evidence was not due to oversight. It was due to absence. Something essential was missing, and no amount of speculation could replace it. In the end, The theories said more about those who believed them than about what had actually happened. They reflected fear, hope, logic, denial. They revealed the human need to assign meaning, even when meaning refuses to be found. What remained undeniable was this. Two people had entered a familiar forest on a known trail, and the world had failed to record their exit. No theory could change that, and as long as that remained true, the mystery was not just unsolved. It was unresolved, lingering in the spaces where certainty once lived. Time did not bring answers. It brought distance. And distance, instead of softening the disappearance, seemed to sharpen it in quieter, more painful ways. When the searches officially ended, there was no announcement that felt final enough to match the weight of the moment. Resources were reallocated. Personnel moved on. Paperwork was filed. The forest, once crowded with movement and urgency, returned to stillness. For those left behind, that stillness was unbearable. In the early months, there was still a sense of suspended urgency. Phones were kept close. Even at night, every unknown number felt significant. Every knock at the door carried the brief, irrational hope that this would be it, the moment when the story shifted, when something broke through the silence. But nothing ever did. Instead, life continued in fragments. People returned to work because bills didn't disappear just because someone else had. Conversations resumed, but they were altered. Laughter came back unevenly, often followed by guilt. How could the world still function when two people had vanished from it without explanation? The absence became a constant presence. It sat quietly in rooms where chairs went unused. It lingered in routines that no longer made sense. Holidays arrived and passed, each one marking time not by celebration, but by who wasn't there. Birthdays became especially cruel, proof that time was moving forward without permission. Grief, in this case, had no clear direction. There was no body to mourn, no certainty to anchor emotions. People didn't know which version of loss they were supposed to feel. Was it grief for the dead? Fear for the living? Anger at the unknown? Often, it was all of it at once, cycling without warning. The forest became something no one wanted to name directly. It wasn't spoken about casually. When it came up, voices lowered, as if volume alone might invite something back. For some, the very mention of it caused a physical reaction, a tightening in the chest, a sudden exhaustion. It was no longer just a place. It had become a symbol of everything unresolved. Friends struggled to know what to say. There were no comforting phrases that applied. "They're in a better place" felt premature, even cruel. Everything happened for a reason rang hollow. Over time, silence replaced conversation, not out of indifference, but out of uncertainty. People feared saying the wrong thing, so they said nothing at all. That silence was its own kind of loss. Years passed, and with them came a gradual shift in how the disappearance was discussed publicly. Media interest faded. New stories replaced old ones. The case became something that surfaced only occasionally, usually in brief mentions or anniversary retrospectives. Each appearance felt strange, like watching a memory resurface without context. Privately, the questions never stopped. They changed shape, but they never went away. What if they had taken a different turn? What if the call had been made earlier? What if someone had searched one more mile, one more hour? These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no resolution, only the illusion of control over a past that could not be altered. For the families, the hardest part was learning how to live without conclusions. Society is structured around endings, funerals, death certificates, legal processes that allow people to move forward, even if emotionally they never fully do. None of that existed here. The disappearance had frozen time in an awkward, unfinished position. There were moments of false hope, reported sightings that went nowhere, unidentified remains found in other regions, each one requiring consideration, each one reopening wounds. DNA tests were conducted, files were reviewed, and every time the answer was the same: not them. As the years accumulated, the missing began to age only in memory. Photographs stayed the same. Faces remained fixed in a moment that no longer matched reality. People who loved them grew older, while they remained suspended, untouched by time. It created a dissonance that was difficult to articulate. the sense that someone was both gone and unchanged. Some people coped by creating rituals, visiting the trailhead quietly, leaving flowers, even though there was no grave, writing letters that would never be read. These acts were not about belief in return, but about acknowledgement, about refusing to let the absence erase the reality that they had lived. Others avoided the forest entirely, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. To walk those paths felt like reopening a wound that never healed. The idea that strangers now passed through the same space, without knowing what had been lost there, felt unbearable. The forest, for its part, did not change. It did not mark the passing years. Trees grew, branches fell, new paths formed where old ones faded. Nature reclaimed and rearranged without sentiment. It was indifferent to anniversaries, to grief, to memory. That indifference was perhaps the most painful realization of all. As time stretched on, the disappearance began to feel less like an event and more like a condition, something permanent, embedded in the lives of those who remembered. It shaped decisions, relationships, even identities. People became the ones who lost them, a label they never asked for and could not escape. The question of what happened became less urgent than the reality of not knowing. The mystery settled into the background of daily life, not resolved, but integrated. It was carried quietly, like a weight no one else could see. And yet, despite the years, the case never fully closed. Files remained. Evidence was preserved. The possibility of discovery lingered, however remote. That possibility was both a comfort and a burden. It meant the story was not finished, but it also meant it could reopen at any moment. The forest held on to its silence through all of it. Seasons turned, memories faded, and still it offered nothing. No answers, no closure, just the same paths, waiting, as if daring someone to believe that time alone could solve what it had hidden. For those who lived with the disappearance, time did not heal. It only taught them how to carry the unanswered question without dropping it. And somewhere in that forest, unseen and untouched, the space where two people vanished remained exactly as it had always been, unchanged, unmarked, and impossibly quiet. For a long time, nothing changed. The disappearance settled into history, not resolved, but archived, filed away in boxes, remembered only when someone chose to remember it. Years passed in a way that felt both slow and cruelly fast. Children grew up. Parents grew older. The world accumulated new stories, new mysteries, new tragedies that demanded attention. This one faded, not because it mattered less, but because time has a way of teaching people how to look past what cannot be fixed. Then, quietly, it returned. It didn't announce itself with urgency or spectacle. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden confession, no long-lost recording uncovered by chance. The real awakening of the case began in the most unremarkable way possible, through routine, work that had nothing to do with the disappearance. A person who had no connection to the story at all. The forest had changed since the last official search, but only subtly. Trails had shifted slightly with use. Some paths were narrower now, others wider. Trees had grown thicker in places, thinning in others. Nature rearranged itself patiently, unconcerned with human memory. What had once been familiar had become quietly unfamiliar, even to those who had walked it years earlier. The person who found it was not looking for answers. That detail would matter later. They weren't searching for the missing. They weren't retracing old routes or studying faded maps. They were there for an entirely different reason. Work, solitude, curiosity, routine. Accounts would differ on exactly who they were and why they were there, but what mattered was the same across every retelling. The discovery was accidental. It happened in a part of the forest that felt removed from everything else. Not dangerous, just distant. The kind of place you don't end up unless you have a reason to be there, or unless you wander farther than most people do. It wasn't marked as off-limits. It wasn't hidden. It was simply overlooked. At first, what they saw didn't register as important. Fabric catches the eye differently in nature. Unnatural lines, colors that don't belong, a shape where there shouldn't be one. Even then, the mind resists significance. People are trained to assume harmless explanations first. Old trash, lost gear, something left behind by someone long gone. But the longer they looked, the harder it became to dismiss. The clothing was weathered, but not destroyed, faded by time, but intact enough to be recognizable. It didn't appear scattered or torn apart. It was there, present in a way that felt deliberate, even if no intention could be assigned to it. Not buried, not hidden, just there. The moment realization began to form, it came slowly, reluctantly. Recognition is rarely instant in situations like this. It creeps in through comparison. A memory of a photograph seen long ago, a description read in passing, the shape of something aligning with a story that had never truly gone away. When authorities were notified, the response was cautious. Decades had passed. Discoveries made so long after the fact are often disappointing, leading nowhere, answering nothing. Still, protocol demanded attention. The forest, silent for so long, was about to be asked questions again. When investigators arrived, they moved carefully, as if time itself were fragile there. The area was documented. Photographs were taken, coordinates recorded. The clothing was handled gently, with the awareness that whatever answers it might hold had waited a very long time to surface. Identification took time, but not as much as people expected. The details matched. Brand, style, size, items consistent with what the missing hikers had been wearing on the day they vanished. The confirmation landed heavily, not as relief, but as shock. For years, the disappearance had existed in abstraction, a question without an object, a story without a tangible anchor. Now, suddenly, there was something real, something physical, that connected the present to the past. The news spread carefully at first. Authorities contacted families privately, aware that this was not the kind of information that should arrive without warning. The reactions varied, but none were simple. There were tears, yes, but also confusion, anger, and a deep, unsettling sense of unease, because the discovery did not answer the question everyone had been carrying. It complicated it. The location alone raised immediate concerns. This area had been searched, not casually, not briefly, but thoroughly. Dogs had passed through. Teams had walked it. The idea that clothing could have remained there undetected for decades strained belief. And yet, there it was. The condition of the items added another layer of discomfort. Nature is not gentle with fabric. Time degrades. Animals scatter. Weather destroys. But these clothes told a different story, one that did not align with decay as it was understood. The case, once dormant, came alive again, but it was not the kind of revival anyone had hoped for. Instead of clarity, it brought dissonance. Instead of resolution, it reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar over. Media attention returned, sharper now because of the time involved. Headlines emphasized the gap between disappearance and discovery. Decades later, found in a remote forest. The phrasing itself carried an implied question. How? People who had never heard of the case before encountered it for the first time, while those who remembered it felt a strange sense of dislocation. It was like watching a ghost step back into the light. Not fully formed, not explainable, but impossible to ignore. Investigators revisited old files. Maps were unrolled again. Notes reread. Timelines reconstructed. The forest was approached once more, not with hope this time, but with suspicion. Something had been missed, or something had changed. The discovery forced everyone to confront an unsettling possibility, that the forest had not simply held on to evidence, but that evidence had arrived there later. That idea was rarely spoken aloud at first. It lingered in pauses, in careful phrasing, in the way experts chose their words. No one wanted to speculate without proof, but the questions were unavoidable. Where had the clothing been all this time? Why here? Why now? For families, the return of the case was emotionally disorienting. They had spent years learning how to live with not knowing. The discovery disrupted that fragile equilibrium. It suggested proximity to truth, while withholding it just out of reach. The forest, once again, became a place of attention. But this time it felt different. Not like a site of loss, but like a stage where time itself had folded, allowing the past to intrude upon the present without explanation. What had been buried by years of silence was no longer silent, and whatever answers might exist were no longer content to remain hidden. The disappearance was no longer just something that had happened long ago. It was happening again. The clothing changed everything, not because it solved the mystery, but because it refused to behave the way evidence is supposed to. When it was laid out for documentation, each item told a quiet, unsettling story. Fabric thinned by years of exposure, colors dulled by time, yet still recognizable, still whole, still present. It was not what anyone expected to see after decades of forests that experienced rain, snow, animals, and constant seasonal change. Investigators approached the items with caution that bordered on reverence. This was no longer an abstract case file or a set of theories pinned to a board. This was something real, tangible proof that the hikers had been somewhere after the moment they vanished from certainty. But proof of what, exactly, remained painfully unclear. Each piece was cataloged carefully. Clothing worn on the day of the hike. Items that matched descriptions given years earlier by family members who had repeated those details so many times they could recite them without effort. Seeing them again, in physical form, was overwhelming. For some, it felt like confirmation of loss. For others, it felt like a cruel trick. Evidence without explanation, closure without peace. The way the clothes were found disturbed those who examined the scene. They were not scattered wildly, as might be expected if animals had dragged them or if a violent struggle had occurred. They were not buried beneath layers of forest debris, nor were they reduced to fragments. They existed in a state that felt suspended between abandonment and placement, as if they had arrived there under conditions that did not fully align with nature's usual processes. The location itself deepened the unease. This was not an untouched area. It had been part of earlier search grids. It had been walked by trained responders, volunteers, dogs. The probability that something this significant could have gone unnoticed for decades strained logic. Investigators revisited old search maps, overlaying them with the discovery site, hoping to find a margin of error that could explain it away. There wasn't one. Experts weighed in cautiously. Some suggested environmental explanations, microclimates, patterns of vegetation growth, natural concealment, followed by gradual exposure over time. These explanations sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, but they failed to satisfy those who understood the scale of the search that had once taken place. Others pointed out inconsistencies. Fabric that should have degraded more, items that should have been moved by animals or weather. Nothing about the clothing told a straightforward story. Families were invited to view the items, though the experience was optional. Some chose to see them, believing they owed it to the truth, whatever that truth might be. Others couldn't bear the idea. Those who did go described the experience as disorienting. These were objects that had once been part of daily life, washed, folded, worn without thought. Now, they were artifacts, separated from their owners by time and mystery. There was an expectation, unspoken but powerful, that the discovery would bring answers, that it would finally clarify what had happened in the forest. Instead, it raised new questions that felt heavier than the old ones. Questions that challenged not just the disappearance, but the timeline itself. Why were the clothes there, but not other belongings? Where were the backpacks? The shoes? The personal items that should have accompanied them? Partial evidence creates a different kind of anxiety. It suggests intention without revealing motive. It implies a sequence of events without revealing the beginning or the end. Media coverage intensified, and with it came renewed speculation. Armchair investigators dissected photographs of clothing, zooming in on fibers, folds, shadows. Some claimed the arrangement indicated careful placement. Others argued it was random, the result of years of subtle movement by wind and water. Every interpretation contradicted another, and none could be proven conclusively. Investigators remained careful in their language. They acknowledged the significance of the find, but avoided definitive statements. They spoke of potential insight and ongoing analysis, phrases that sounded hopeful but carried no promises. Privately, many admitted that the clothing complicated the case in ways they had not anticipated. The forest itself seemed unchanged by the discovery. It did not reveal anything else. No additional items surfaced. No hidden remains were uncovered. It was as if the clothing was a single message delivered without context, a fragment of a story torn from the middle. For the families, this partial return was emotionally brutal. For years, they had lived with nothing. Now they had something, and it was somehow worse. The presence of the clothing made the absence of answers more pronounced. It forced them to confront the reality that the truth might be far more complex and far more unreachable than they had imagined. There was also a haunting implication that few wanted to voice, that the clothing might not have been there all along, that it might have arrived later, that time in the forest did not move in the way people assumed it did. This idea hovered at the edges of official discussions, never stated outright, but never fully dismissed either. Scientific tests were conducted where possible. Fibers were examined. Environmental impact assessed. Results were inconclusive. Nothing definitively explained how the clothing had survived, how it had remained unseen, or how it had come to rest in that exact location. The case, once defined by absence, was now defined by contradiction. Evidence existed, but it did not behave like evidence. It pointed in multiple directions at once, offering no clear path forward. Each answer produced another question. Each attempt at explanation revealed new inconsistencies. What unsettled investigators most was not what the clothing showed, but what it refused to show. There were no signs of violence, no clear indicators of accident, no definitive markers of time. It was as if the clothes had been stripped of context, leaving behind only their physical presence. The discovery forced everyone involved to reconsider their assumptions. The forest was no longer just a place where something had happened. It was now a place where something had returned, delayed, altered, and deeply unsettling. The clothing did not close the case. It opened it wider than ever before. And in doing so, it transformed the disappearance from a tragic mystery into something far more disturbing. A story where time itself seemed unreliable, and where evidence arrived not to explain the past, but to challenge it. The mountain holds more than echoes of footsteps. It preserves the intangible weight of human lives, choices, and secrets. For 25 years, the hiker's disappearance has been remembered as a tragedy of nature, a solitary figure lost in the wild. But the deeper story is often hidden in the quiet spaces between people, in the glances not exchanged and the conversations never recorded. Family photographs, yellowed letters, and home videos reveal glimpses of a life that was outwardly ordinary yet quietly turbulent. Friends describe him as reliable, cheerful, even charming, but with moments of unspoken tension. He always carried a weight. One childhood friend recalls, voice low, almost apologetic. You'd never know at first. He smiled, joked, but sometimes it was like he was somewhere else, thinking about something we couldn't see. These recollections begin to suggest that his life, though outwardly serene, contained hidden layers, a complexity that the wilderness alone cannot explain. Neighbors speak of late-night visitors, fleeting interactions at the edge of town that went unnoticed at the time, only now recalled with unease. There were moments when the hiker would disappear for hours before a hike, leaving cryptic notes or messages that he claimed were nothing serious, yet now read like fragments of secret life. The documentary-style narration highlights the subtle contradiction. A man of routine and familiarity, whose ordinary life contained extraordinary gaps, hints, and shadows. Romantic relationships come into focus, not as scandalous revelations, but as windows into his inner world. A former partner remembers long silences at dinner, unanswered questions about work, and occasional bursts of intensity, moments of joy followed by retreat. He loved fully, but there were parts of him no one could touch, she reflects, tears brimming. Parts he didn't even let himself face. The narration emphasizes a human need to understand, to piece together connections between internal struggle and external behavior. Could these inner conflicts, once invisible, have played a role in the decisions that led him to that fateful trail? Colleagues and acquaintances paint a similar picture. On the surface, he was dependable, methodical, and attentive. Behind closed doors, there were hints of anxiety and private obsessions. Journals filled with careful observations, sketchbooks with intricate maps of trails, lists of people met briefly yet remembered in detail. Some pages are mundane, almost comforting in their precision. Others hint at a restless mind, searching for meaning, patterns, or perhaps escape. The narration lingers on these details, portraying a hiker not as a victim of circumstance alone, but as a man wrestling with hidden pressures. The story takes a delicate turn when the narration examines family dynamics. Siblings recall unspoken rivalries and jealousies, the subtle tug-of-war for parental attention, and the ways in which small misunderstandings could fester into lasting tensions. He didn't hold grudges, a sister explains, voice tight with emotion, but he carried things quietly alone. He never wanted to burden anyone. Here, the mountain is contrasted with domestic spaces. Just as the wilderness offers isolation, so too did the family home, providing both sanctuary and silence. Emotional tension grows in the recognition that hidden motives are rarely dramatic. They often emerge quietly, invisibly, leaving only questions in their wake. The hikers' friendships also reveal subtle, unresolved conflicts. Close friends recount evenings of laughter overshadowed by fleeting disputes, unspoken judgments, and moments of disconnection. Some friends reflect on a time when he confided in them about feeling out of step with life's expected rhythm, a sense of being caught between who he was and who others expected him to be. The narration underscores a psychological complexity. Human relationships are rarely linear, and even the strongest bonds can conceal quiet rifts that shape decisions and paths. Perhaps most unsettling are the ambiguous hints that surface from conversations with neighbors and acquaintances who were tangentially connected. A casual remark about seeing him near a remote trailhead the week before the disappearance, a fleeting encounter with someone unidentified, or vague recollections of a phone call that never seemed important at the time. All of these threads are presented carefully, without speculation, yet they suggest that interpersonal factors may have intersected with the natural dangers of the hike. The audience is invited to consider that tragedy is rarely the result of a single cause. It is woven from choices, circumstances, and the invisible threads of human connection. Psychologically, this section emphasizes duality. The hiker is simultaneously familiar and unknowable, a man whose surface life offered comfort and stability, but whose inner life was marked by mystery. The narration pauses on moments that crystallize this tension, a journal page detailing a map of the mountains, juxtaposed with a family photo where he smiles into the camera, an unmailed letter tucked into a drawer, its content intimate, anxious, unresolved. Each artifact becomes a lens through which viewers confront the complexity of human behavior and the subtle ways private struggles ripple outward into the world. The documentary style deliberately avoids sensationalism, instead cultivating empathy and curiosity. The narration highlights that uncovering hidden lives is not about assigning blame, but understanding depth. It is in the quiet details, the way he laughed, paused, or avoided certain topics, that the story's true emotional weight is found. These details, ordinary yet charged with meaning, form connective tissue of the mystery, suggesting that the disappearance may not have been solely an accident or a simple misstep, but perhaps a culmination of layered human experiences, relationships, and choices. Toward the close of this section, the narrative draws subtle parallels between the mountain and human psyche. Just as trails diverge, merge, and sometimes end abruptly in hidden clearings or sheer drops, so too do the hiker's inner life branch unpredictably, with paths unknown even to those closest to him. This metaphor reinforces a slow burn tension. The audience is left reflecting on the delicate, invisible intersections between human emotion, hidden fears, and the unforgiving natural world. Finally, the narration hints at unanswered questions that will carry into the next section. Was a hiker's disappearance the result of circumstances beyond his control, or was it entangled with the hidden complexities of his life? Were there choices made, however subtle, that nudged events toward tragedy? These questions are deliberately unresolved, contrasting with the cold procedural analysis of Section 8, and leaving viewers with a haunting, reflective suspense, a sense that the mountain holds not just bodies or objects, but the echo of human secrets, quietly preserved across decades. In the wake of discovery, human minds cannot rest on silence. Mystery breeds speculation, and speculation can become obsession. As investigators and family members sifted through decades of overlooked clues, the story of the hiker's disappearance transformed into a labyrinth of theories, each one reflecting not just the case itself, but the fears, hopes, and doubts of those trying to understand it. The first theory, the simplest and most immediate, is that of accidental death. The mountain, serene yet treacherous, holds hidden dangers, loose rocks, sudden drop-offs, unpredictable weather. Each a subtle, almost invisible threat. Experts in wilderness survival describe how even a seasoned hiker, confident and careful, can be undone by a single misstep or a momentary lapse. Narration emphasizes the cruel impartiality of nature. It does not wait, it does not forgive, and it leaves no trace except what is found decades later. Eyewitness accounts place the hiker near a narrow ridge the day he disappeared, and photographs of the trail show sections where paths are almost swallowed by underbrush. The theory of accident resonates emotionally because it aligns with human vulnerability. It is tragic yet understandable, a story of one person confronting forces far beyond control. Yet, as the narration turns to other possibilities, the tone darkens subtly, hinting at the tension between comfort and doubt. Some investigators and armchair theorists argue that foul play cannot be ruled out. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. A misplaced backpack, a pair of hiking boots found far from the trail, and minor inconsistencies in witness statements. Interviews with retired detectives reveal that, in cases like this, the mountain can obscure more than just bodies. It can conceal human intent. The narration carefully presents these theories without sensationalism, emphasizing the psychological impact of uncertainty. To imagine that someone could have been deliberately endangered is to confront the shadow side of human nature, the part that thrives in secrecy and manipulation. There wasn't one. Experts weighed in cautiously. Some suggested environmental explanations, microclimates, patterns of vegetation growth, natural concealment, followed by gradual exposure over time. These explanations sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, but they failed to satisfy those who understood the scale of the search that had once taken place. Others pointed out inconsistencies. Fabric that should have degraded more, items that should have been moved by animals or weather. Nothing about the clothing told a straightforward story. Families were invited to view the items, though the experience was optional. Some chose to see them, believing they owed it to the truth, whatever that truth might be. Others couldn't bear the idea. Those who did go described the experience as disorienting. These were objects that had once been part of daily life, washed, folded, worn without thought. Now they were artifacts, separated from their owners by time and mystery. There was an expectation, unspoken but powerful, that the discovery would bring answers, that it would finally clarify what had happened in the forest. Instead, it raised new questions that felt heavier than the old ones. Questions that challenged not just the disappearance, but the timeline itself. Why were the clothes there, but not other belongings? Where were the backpacks? The shoes? The personal items that should have accompanied them? Partial evidence creates a different kind of anxiety. It suggests intention without revealing motive. It implies a sequence of events without revealing the beginning or the end. Media coverage intensified, and with it came renewed speculation. Armchair investigators dissected photographs of the clothing, zooming in on fibers, folds, shadows. Some claimed the arrangement indicated careful placement. Others argued it was random, the result of years of subtle movement by wind and water. Every interpretation contradicted another, and none could be proven conclusively. Investigators remained careful in their language. They acknowledged the significance of find, but avoided definitive statements. They spoke of potential insight and ongoing analysis, phrases that sounded hopeful but carried no promises. Privately, many admitted that the clothing complicated the case in ways they had not anticipated. The forest itself seemed unchanged by the discovery. It did not reveal anything else. No additional items surfaced. No hidden remains were uncovered. It was as if the clothing was a single message delivered without context, a fragment of the story torn from the middle. For the families, this partial return was emotionally brutal. For years, they had lived with nothing. Now they had something, and it was somehow worse. The presence of the clothing made the absence of answers more pronounced. It forced them to confront the reality that the truth might be far more complex and far more unreachable than they had imagined. There was also a haunting implication that few wanted to voice, that the clothing might not have been there all along. Others, however, venture into the realm of the inexplicable. Unverified sightings, odd markings on trees, and cryptic journal entries from the hiker himself have fueled speculation that something stranger, something almost beyond rational explanation, might have played a role. Local legends speak of the mountain as a place where time and perception warp, where trails vanish and reappear, and where the natural world intersects with the human imagination in unsettling ways. Narration in this section becomes more lyrical, almost hypnotic. guiding the audience through a landscape both real and imagined, blending the visual serenity of sun-dappled pines with the eerie sense of unseen presence. Emotionally, it taps into a universal fascination, the desire to believe that the world is richer, stranger, and more mysterious than simple explanations allow. The section juxtaposes expert testimony with intimate reflection. Forensic specialists recount the limitations of evidence after decades of exposure, noting that decomposition, weather, and human activity erase details, leaving only fragments to interpret. Armchair investigators contribute another layer, combing through photographs, maps, and online archives in search of patterns overlooked by official channels. Their obsessions mirror a psychological truth. In the absence of certainty, human minds crave narrative. They must weave order from chaos, even if the story they construct is provisional, even if it is ultimately unknowable. One particularly compelling theory emerges from a combination of these threads, that the hiker's disappearance was neither simple accident nor straightforward foul play, but a convergence of personal choices, interpersonal dynamics, and the mountain's indifferent hazards. Narration emphasizes the complexity of human behavior, a misstep born of distraction, perhaps influenced by unresolved emotional tension, a trail known to few, yet chosen in secrecy, and the mountain itself a silent participant, impartial but exacting. The section portrays this convergence as psychologically plausible, heightening suspense without forcing resolution. Emotionally, viewers are invited to feel both the fragility and the agency inherent in human decision-making. Cinematically, the section contrasts past serenity with present uncertainty. Archival footage of the hiker, smiling at a campsite, adjusting a backpack, pausing to admire a vista, is intercut with slow, panning shots of the overgrown trail and the tree where the recent discovery was made. The narration underscores emotional dissonance, the joy and promise captured in old photographs against the shadow of ambiguity cast by new findings. Viewers are reminded that memory, like evidence, is selective. It illuminates some details while obscuring others, leaving only fragments that must be stitched together into understanding. Interviews add emotional texture. A friend who once hiked with him recalls a quiet argument over the choice of trails, a fleeting disagreement that at the time seemed inconsequential. A sibling describes a hiker's obsession with planning, yet occasional impulsiveness. These small, human moments are framed not as guilt or blame, but as evidence of layered, unpredictable behavior. The narration dwells on these subtleties, reinforcing that mysteries of this nature often lie not in spectacular acts, but in ordinary human inconsistencies amplified by circumstance. The psychological tension deepens as family members confront the theories themselves. Some cling to the accident narrative for comfort. Others find themselves haunted by the possibility of intentional harm or inexplicable forces. The narration highlights the duality of belief and doubt. Certainty is elusive, and the mind, when starved to closure, fills the void with conjecture. This mirrors the audience's own experience. Watching, waiting, questioning, seeking resolution that may never come. The documentary style allows space for these emotions to breathe, lingering on pauses, facial expressions, and unspoken reactions. Obsession, too, becomes a theme in this section. Investigators speak of nights spent reviewing maps and timelines, searching for a pattern that might never exist. Online sleuths recount obsessive note-taking, revisiting weather reports from decades prior, and comparing anecdotal accounts for hidden connections. Narration reflects on the human need to impose order on uncertainty, a need that can both illuminate and distort. The mountain, impartial and enduring, remains a counterpoint. It does not reward speculation, it only endures. The tension between human desire for understanding and the mountain's indifference creates an emotional resonance that is both haunting and reflective. As the section draws towards conclusion, the narration circles back to a central truth. The mystery endures not because answers are impossible, but because human perception is partial. Theories multiply, obsessions deepen, and yet certainty remains elusive. Each hypothesis, accident, foul play, or something stranger, offers a window into human emotion. Fear, hope, grief, fascination. Cinematically, this is mirrored by a sequence of shots blending archival imagery, present-day forests, and close-ups of artifacts and evidence, emphasizing both the continuity of the mountain and the shifting perspectives of those who interpret it. Finally, the section leaves viewers suspended between resolution and ambiguity. Theories have been presented, obsessions explored, yet the truth remains veiled in shadow. Narration emphasizes that in the absence of certainty, human experience is defined not just by what is known, but by what is imagined, feared, and hoped for. The audience is invited to linger in the space, to feel the tension between serenity and doubt, and to recognize that some mysteries endure precisely because they reflect the complexity of human life itself. The mountain, silent and eternal, watches over the threads of obsession, theory, and grief, a monument to the unknowable, holding within its trees the echoes of a life and a disappearance that refuses to be neatly explained. The mountain does not speak, yet it leaves its mark on every mind that crosses its trails. Years pass, seasons change, and yet the echoes remain. Footsteps long vanished, conversations never heard, choices forever suspended between memory and mystery. As the sun filters through the dense canopy, casting fractured light across moss-covered rocks and twisted roots, the mountain seems alive with a quiet, unyielding presence, patient in its silence, indifferent to human longing. In this stillness, the story of the hiker lingers, unresolved, a fragment of the world that refuses to be fully understood. Family and friends recall the disappearance not as a single moment, but as a series of resonant tremors that shaped the years that followed. The grief, the hope, the obsessive replaying of small decisions. These are the threads that linger in the absence of answers. Interviews reflect a shared truth. The mind cannot rest when closure is denied. Each visitor to the mountain feels it differently. The pull of curiosity, the weight of uncertainty, the quiet ache of memory. The narration emphasizes the enduring psychological impact, suggesting that the mystery itself has become a living presence in the lives it touched. The forested trails, silent and overgrown, hold a duality of beauty and menace. Panning shots capture the serenity of sunlit clearings, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of the bird. Yet shadows gather in unexpected places, a fallen branch that resembles a path, a rustle that hints at unseen movement, a hollow where the wind sighs like a whisper. Cinematically, these contrasts mirror the human mind grappling with unresolved questions. Hope and dread interwoven, curiosity tinged with fear. The mountain is both sanctuary and enigma, a mirror of the hiker's hidden life, the lingering theories and the obsessions that followed. The narration turns to reflection. What does it mean to live with mystery? What remains when answers are forever out of reach? The hiker's life, once ordinary and then fractured by disappearance, has become a lens through which the fragility and resilience of human emotion are magnified. Each object recovered, each journal entry, each whispered memory, carries weight beyond its physical presence. It is evidence not only of what happened, but how profoundly absence can shape the living. The audience is invited to inhabit the space between knowing and imagining, to feel the slow burn tension of a story that refuses to be neatly resolved. As the documentary draws toward its conclusion, the mountain itself becomes a central character, eternal, silent, a repository of memory, loss, and unanswered questions. Trails may shift, trees may grow, and decades may pass, but the mountain endures impartial and observing. Its immensity contrasts with human fragility. It's indifferent a reminder that not all stories are meant to be completed. Yet, in its constancy, there is beauty and awe, a poetic reflection that life, like the wilderness, is complex, unpredictable, and profoundly mysterious. Finally, the narration leaves viewers suspended in contemplation. Questions hang in the air. What truly happened on that fateful hike? How much of the hiker's life, choices, and secrets shape the outcome? Could any of the discoveries, theories, or obsessions bring clarity, or are they merely fragments in a story that will never be fully known? The camera lingers on the trailhead, where sunlight fades into shadow, and on the tree where the decades-old discovery was made, its branches swaying gently in the wind. The mountain holds its secrets close, and in doing so, it teaches a quiet lesson. That mystery, in its purest form, is both haunting and essential, a reminder that some stories live beyond resolution, echoing endlessly in the human mind and in the pines.